Okay, so this is what Blender is going to look like when you first open it. I'll talk for a moment about the interface, but we're not really going to have to make many changes to the interface. So it's not as important for our workflow as it might be for other workflows. But you can see that Blender has a lot of different like tabs up here, and there's a lot of different like ways that you can use Blender for different components of 3D modeling and rendering. And the interface is in some ways similar to like an Adobe interface that you might be used to, where you can make a lot of changes, but it's even more sort of customizable in the sense that like basically every window can be any other window. So the default window looks like this, but I can just like collapse these guys and just make like one big window like this, and do a bunch of different stuff. But if you kind of want to start over, you can always go to New and go to General, and it'll look like what it looks like when you first open it. If you go to New, there's like a few other options for different types of workflows, like 2D animation, sculpting, VFX video editing. General is really all we'll ever need for this class. We probably won't even move beyond this main layout tab. But there are other tabs. We might do some like texture painting or UV editing at some point, or shader stuff, but probably not. In each sort of main window, there's like a little drop down where you can choose what window it is. And we won't really change these that much either, but you can see all the different options. So each window is really the same thing. It's just like open to a different setting. So this 3D viewport is kind of the main editor window. And then these defaults over here are useful. This is the outliner. This is sort of like the scene node in Godot. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can do that, yeah. Okay, that's pretty good, right? So yeah, this guy up here at the top right is the outliner. This shows you everything that's in the scene. So there's like a collection, there's a camera, which we don't really need. So we're gonna delete it in a moment. There's the default cube, which always shows up when you create a new scene, and then there's a light. And we're not gonna use the camera or the light much. So if you wanna get rid of something, you can either select it in the 3D view or in the scene collection and just hit X on the keyboard and it'll remove it. Blender also uses a lot of key commands. So I have this, I'm gonna turn on these screencast keys over here. So you don't have to do this. So this is just like a little add-on, but this will just show you what key I'm hitting at various points. So that'll make it a little bit easier. But Blender, like Photoshop, uses a lot of key commands to speed up your workflow. And so I'll try to talk about those. But you could also right-click here and go to Delete. And so we'll just have our cube. This window down here is the Properties section. And there's lots of different like tabs here. We won't use too many of these right now, but we'll probably use the Modifier tab. But there's lots of different stuff in here. Your scene collection has like folders. It's gonna have this like default collection. We'll just leave that for now. We might do more with that later, but for now we'll just kind of leave that alone. So yeah, I'm gonna save this project and then I'm gonna start editing some stuff. So I'm gonna hit Command S to save. I'm gonna go into my project folder and I'm just gonna make a new folder here called Blenders. I'm gonna keep my Blender files separate from my exported models, which I'll put in a different folder. So I'm gonna go to Blenders, and I'm just gonna say intro example as the file name. And I'm just gonna make like a really simple model, and then export it to Godot, and then we'll see a good workflow, because a lot of times you wanna be able to make changes to the model, and then export it again, and you'll see that it updates in Godot. So a couple key commands that are really useful. if you hit T, it opens and closes this toolbar on the side. And most Windows have one of those, not all of them, but most have like a little toolbar. We don't really need the toolbar very much, so I usually get rid of it. But it has some different tools, kind of like in Godot. Like there's a move tool where you can move the object. There's a rotate tool to rotate, scale to scale, etc. This is all of them. But you can also do that without using the tool pretty easily. So I'll talk about that in a moment. So I usually just leave this on the default selection tool here and then get rid of that. If I hit N, it opens this other menu over here, which is like the transform menu and the tool menu and some other stuff. And this can be useful if you want to like set. So the transform works similarly in Godot or any other 3D program where we can set the location and the rotation and scale of our object directly. So if I want to, move it on the x-axis, which is the red line, I can do that, or on the green y-axis, or on the z, which is blue. So we can do that there. But we'll also be able to do that in the editor in a moment. There's rotation as well, everything that you would expect here. So that's N. So I'll bring that up occasionally, but usually I have that hidden over here. There's also this little gizmo where you can like change the rotation of the scene and look at stuff. That's really useful. And there's a zoom tool where if you click on that and then just zoom in and out with your mouse, you'll zoom in and out. And it zooms into this little circle, which is the 3D cursor, which you can move if you want to by choosing the 3D cursor tool and then clicking in different places. And so then, actually it's zooming into what's selected, so that must be a different setting. Anyway, I almost never really use the 3D cursor tool, so I'm not gonna talk about it very much. Then you can set the camera view, but we don't have a camera, so we're gonna ignore that. You can also pan using this little hand guy. And then you can change perspective or orthographic view with this little toggle here. Perspective view is like what it looks like from a camera. Orthographic view is like flattened out as if there were no perspective. So sometimes it's helpful to see all the geometry. You can also do all those things with the mouse. So a lot of what you do is with the mouse, you can zoom in and out with the scroll wheel. You can rotate by holding the scroll wheel down as a button. And then if you hold shift and the scroll wheel, you can pan. So that's what I do most of the time. I don't really use these guys very often. But you can also change the view with these guys, which is kind of useful. But another thing that is sort of more useful is setting up some other key commands. So Blender typically uses the numpad to change the camera views. But if you don't have a numpad, which is probably the case for most of us, the numpad is like the square numbers on the side that you have on some keyboards. We can recreate that if we go to settings. So if you hit command or control comma, you'll bring up these preferences. And there's this section called the key map here where you can set lots of different stuff. And in here, or actually not in here, in input, there's an option under keyboard to emulate numpad. So this is in preferences, input, and then keyboard, emulate numpad. This will turn the number keys at the top of your keyboard into your camera controls. And these are super useful. If you hit 1, it goes to front view. If you hit 2, it sort of rotates around the front. If you hit 3, it goes to side right view. I think if you hit shift 3, no, that doesn't do anything. Okay. If we hit 1, we go to front. If we go to 3, we go to right view. If you hit 5, that toggles orthographic versus perspective. 4 rotates around the z-axis. And 6 rotates the other way around. And then 7 is top view. 8 rotates around the x-axis. 9... I don't know what that does. It's rotating us in some direction. And then 0 goes to the camera view if you have a camera, but we don't have a camera. And so this is useful because you can make edits and then quickly switch between views to see how it looks in different ways. So when you when people are using Blender, they're going to be switching between camera views a lot. Something that you'll also see is like if I open another window, I can have one view on this side and one view on this side. So if I'm editing, whoops. I got stuck in a, what is that? Okay, for some reason it won't let me get out of this selection thingy. Let's just close this. Okay, I'm still stuck in here. Okay, this is weird. Usually when I hit enter, it gets rid of this selection thing, but it's not doing it. Okay, so I'm just gonna start a new, okay, I can't even, okay. Okay, so, sorry, I don't have my normal key commands, so sometimes I'm gonna get stuff wrong. Because you can set the key commands to whatever you want, and so I have a slightly different setup. Okay, anyway, we've got our cube. So yeah, a lot of time you'll have a couple windows like this, and so you'll have one view over here and another view over here, and you know, you can see what is different on different sides. But we're gonna keep things simple today. We're just gonna keep one view. If you hit F, that will focus your thing. Or no, it won't. Okay, maybe that's Godot. Let's look up what the key map for focus is. Okay, it doesn't have one. So let's see if we can find... active object. Huh. Okay, for some reason that option's not here. So I'll have to look that up later. But we'll just keep going. Okay, so with Blender, in Godot, when we're adding primitives and stuff like that, we can't actually edit the geometry because Godot is just a game engine. It's not designed for like making 3D models and stuff like that. In Blender, we can edit the mesh and the geometry of the mesh. So in the main object mode, which is what we're in now, there's another drop down right here where you can change different modes. In the main object mode, we can basically just move, rotate, transform objects. So this little box, if I hit S, I can scale it. So S is scale. You can also, one way that is very common to work in Blender, if I want to scale something on just one axis, I can hit S, and then if I hit Y, it'll restrict the scale to that one axis. So that's something that you can do a lot. If I hit S and X, I can scale on the X axis. We can turn snapping on, and so then we'll scale only on certain increments. Although, what those increments are... let's switch this to grid. I think the increments are just really small. Let's see, that might be... Okay, let's ignore that for now, it's not super important. Okay. So yeah, we can scale. If we hit R, you can rotate. And again, you can hit one of your coordinates like X or Z to rotate around a specific axis. Let's delete this for a second. If you hit X, you can delete an object. If you hit Shift A, you can add an object. So there's a lot of different types of meshes that you can add. So you can add a plane, which is just a 2D square. You can add a cube. Oh, whoops. You can add a cube, which is what we had before. And then there's a bunch of other stuff. You can add a little circle. You can add a sphere. There's a couple different types of sphere. Sometimes when you add stuff, there'll be some other options in this little menu down here, like how many segments there are and rings. So you can kind of change the level of geometry on the sphere. You can add an icosphere, which is a sphere with slightly different geometry. And you can make it kind of smooth if you add a lot of subdivisions, or less smooth. You can add a cylinder, and it's the same thing. You can change the number of vertices and the radius. And a cone, same thing. And then there's this little monkey guy, or no, there's a donut. I forgot the donut. You can change the number of segments and the interior and exterior size. And you can add this little monkey guy if you want to. The monkey is named Suzanne, and it's really useful for testing like what a shader or a material will look like, because it has a lot of sort of more complex geometry than just a box or a sphere. So you can add a lot of different meshes. Most of what we'll probably use Blender for in class is like importing other models and editing them. But you might want to make some of your own simple models. So you can do that. So let's add our box again, and let's go over a couple other things we can do. So again, in object mode, I can just do some like rotation, and I can move stuff around. If I want to move, I can hit G to move. And again, I can hit X to restrict to X, or Y or Z to move things around. If you move something or rotate or whatever, and you don't like it and you want to reset it, you can also always open this transform box over here. So I can just reset these values to 0. And I can, set all the other transform values there. So that's object mode. We can scale and do all this stuff. To actually edit the mesh, we're going to want to go to edit mode. When you go to edit mode, you can actually make changes to the mesh. So what you'll see is this outlined version of the geometry where it highlights different components. So up here, these 3 buttons show vertices, which are the little dots that connect the geometry. And if I want to edit this, I can grab one of these vertices and I can move it up. I'm going to turn snapping off for a second. So I can just grab this and then kind of move it around. And then if I go back to object mode, and the quick way to toggle between object mode and edit mode is just with the tab. Guys, I'm getting a little too distracted. You can have a conversation outside, or if you need help with something, we can go over it later. Is that cool? Okay, thanks. Okay, so you'll see me tab back and forth between object mode and edit mode a lot. So let's reset that. I'm just gonna hit undo a few times. Okay. So you can also select multiple vertices. So if I grab this guy and then select this other guy, I can move them at the same time using G, or I can rotate them. I can move them back in here. I can do all sorts of stuff like that. So I can start to kind of manipulate the mesh and make different geometries. And then, when I tab back in here, I'll just have this like mesh, and I can, do different stuff with it. There are like really sophisticated ways of editing the mesh that get pretty complex. We're not going to go into a lot of them today, but I'll show you guys a couple. So I'm going to delete this and add another default cube. And let's put it at 0, 0, 0. And we'll just make a really goofy little model. So if I go into edit mode, by default, everything is going to be selected. You can change the selection. So I prefer this vertex selection. If you hit A, it'll select everything. If you hit double A, or if you double hit A, it'll deselect everything. And then if you hold B, you can make a box over what you want to select, and then you can just edit these vertices together. And you can do that again. If I hit B again and get these guys, now I have all of them. And then once you have some vertices selected, another thing that's really useful is extruding. So extruding will just take this face, these vertices, and make a new thing. So if I hit E, I'll be able to like kind of add to this box. And then I can like rotate and move this around and scale it. And I kind of have this face, and you know, a lot of stuff that you'll make, you kind of do stuff like that. Like maybe I want to make like a little house or something. So extrude is really useful. It's just E, and whatever you have selected is what's going to extrude. So if I hit double A and deselect that, and then I hit B and select this area, then I can extrude over here, and you know, then I can select this area and I can extrude up, and I can start to make some different geometries. So this is something you have to practice a lot. It's kind of awkward at first, but if you want to be able to make cool models, you just kind of spend some time playing around with it, and you'll be able to do some stuff. Another thing that's really useful, if you hit W, I'm back in this weird, what is this thing? Okay, so it's not W, I guess. Oh, it's right click, because I have it on, yeah, anyway. So if you go to right click, there's a few useful things in here. So like if I right click and hit subdivide, it'll subdivide my geometry. So it makes a lot of little extra vertices in between. And it does some basic math to do that. And you can change what that is, but I'm not gonna go over that right now. And so now I have like some extra geometry that I can work with. If you right click and go to, where is it? I don't see it on here. Maybe this is an add-on that we don't have. Okay, whatever. So yeah, so for example, like if I wanted to make like a little chair or something, what I could do, I'm gonna start with a new cube. So I'll make a cube, and I'll just right click and I'll subdivide maybe a couple times. And then I could take like this section back here and extrude that up. And that could be like, you know, the back of the chair. And then maybe I would take, I guess I don't really need all this geometry. Another thing that's useful is there's different views or different ways of viewing it. It's over here. Oh, there's this there's this really big toolbar up here, and if you scroll with the scroll wheel, it'll move over. And if I go like this, if I hit this button, I'll be able to see through the geometry. And so I have too much chair here, so I'm going to select all these vertices and then just delete them. Okay, so that looks better, but now I have this problem where the bottom of my chair is empty. So I should have thought a little bit ahead of time about how I was going to do this, but that's okay. I can just select these vertices. And then if you hit Option Select, it'll select around this ring. And then if you hit F, it'll make a little face around these guys. So it'll make a little a new face. So if you have like empty geometry like that and you select it and hit F, it'll make a face there. And then I can subdivide this. Oh no, I can't. Okay, so I should have planned this out a little bit better. But let's just undo a couple times. Let's just start over. So let's delete our cube. Let's add another cube. And this time I'm just going to go ahead and make the cube a lot smaller. So I'm going to grab these vertices, and I'm going to hit G and Z and move them down here. Okay, now I will grab the whole cube And let's hit G and Z and move it up a little bit. And so now I'll do a subdivision. So I'll right click and subdivide. Okay, so now I'll grab the back of my chair. And I'll hit E and Z, or no, I don't want to hit Z. I just want to hit E, and it's going to choose Z because it's going to figure that out on its own. And I'll make the little back of the chair. And then I could go down here and grab these guys. And I'm going to grab all 4 of my chair legs. So I'm just holding Shift and grabbing these. And then I can extrude all of these at the same time. And so now I've got a little chair. Okay, so it's not the most beautiful chair that's ever been made, but you get the idea. And so there's a lot more stuff that we could do. Oh, I didn't save this. I'm going to overwrite my earlier example. There's a lot more stuff we could do here, but I want to demonstrate getting this into Godot, because that's the main thing that we're going to use this for. So now that we have some basic geometry, what we really want is to be able to take models that we create or edit in Blender and add them into Godot and have them be part of our scene. So to do that, we can select we can export a whole scene, or you can export just something that's selected. I'm going to export this selection. I'm going to rename this chair. So I just double clicked on the model here, or the geometry. And so then I'm going to go to File and go to Export. And there's a lot of different options for the different file formats for 3D meshes. I tend to use this GLTF format. This is a relatively newer format that has slightly better compression. But you could also do OBJ is fine. I would not use Collada. I would not use STL. There's nothing specifically wrong with those formats, but they're just not as widely accepted by game engines or other programs. But Godot is going to be perfectly fine with anything that's an OBJ or a GLB/GLTF. But I also want to kind of show the file size and different things that you'll see with these files. So I'm going to do GLTF to start. And so it's going to give me some options here. I'm still in my Blenders folder. I don't want to save this in my Blenders folder. I'm going to create a new folder for models. So I'm going to go back and click new folder and call this models. And this is in my game project folder. So then I'm going to double click on models to open it. And so then I can choose a format. There's GLTF binary, which is GLB. A binary file means that everything is stuck in there together, all the textures, all the geometry, everything. So that's a more efficient format, but it's, it may be larger, it may have other issues. Usually that'll be fine, but you can also do a GLTF. This is going to separate your textures from your geometry. And so you may, want to compress your textures or do other things that you can't do with the GLB. So we'll look at both of those. You can click to include. So if I click selected objects, it's only going to use the objects that are selected. So if I have like a really complex scene, but I only want to export certain things, this is really useful. You can also do active collection. So if you do active collection, it'll be everything that's inside of one of the collections, which is kind of like a folder. That would be useful if you have like a lot of lighting and cameras and other stuff in your scene that you don't want to go over to Godot. Using the active collection would be useful. Other than that, you don't really need to do anything. I'm just going to do selected object. For the transform, there's this option to do +Y up. This just translates Blender's 3D spatial setup to what's more typical in our game engines like Godot and stuff. With the data, there's a bunch of stuff in here. You could get rid of this stuff, but we don't really have any of this stuff, so we're not really worried about it. And then we don't have any animation, so you can leave this on. It's not really going to matter. Okay, so then we're going to click export. And then I'm going to go over to the Finder. And I'm going to find my project folder. And I'm going to look. So there's my Blenders file. So the .blend is the file that I created. It's not very large. It's 522 kilobytes, so that's not a very big file, but I don't really have that much in there, so that makes sense. There's also, Blender does this kind of funny thing where it makes a backup of your project. So the .blend1 file is just one previous save. And so if you screw something up and you can't recover it, you can always go back to that file. This has saved me in many more than one occasion. So it's kind of nice, but it's kind of random and confusing if you don't know what it is. So there's our Blender file. Under models, you can see our GLB file is right there. It's 12 kilobytes. That's nice and small. So that's good. Let's make another GLTF and just to see the difference. So I'm going to export again. I'm going to go to File, Export, and I'll go to GLTF again. But this time I'm going to choose GLTF separate instead of binary. And then you can actually choose where to put the textures, and you can add a copyright, etc. I'm just going to export. So you can see with our GLTF, there's a GLTF file, which is only 1 kilobyte. We can actually see what's in there if we open it in Sublime Text. It's just a little data file that basically has a breakdown of what's in the project. So you can see there's one scene, there's one node called chair, there's one mesh, which is this cube that I made. So that's all the data. It's right there. So it's not as efficient format because it's not binary, but you can see and edit the data, which is kind of nice. And then it comes along with this bin file. So the bin file is all the binary data for the actual mesh and stuff like that. And so you can see that's 11 kilobytes. So the GLTF plus the bin equals the GLB. So that'll be a little bit different if you have a lot of textures and other crazy stuff going on. But since we just have this really basic geometry, it makes sense that they're basically the same file. So I'm going to work with the GLB for now just because it's simpler. But you can import either one of those into Godot. Okay, so let's go back over to Godot and put this in here. It says it wants to import my blend files, but I don't want it to do that. So I'm just going to say disable.blend. And I guess I have to save and restart. You might want to put your blenders somewhere else to avoid that, but I'll just continue. Okay, so to add one of these guys in here, I'm going to go to my models folder, and I can just drag and drop, and there you can see there's the chair. And you can see that, the positioning of the chair matches what we see in Blender. So the middle of the chair is right in the middle, just like it is over in Blender. The middle of the chair is signified by that yellow dot. If I move the chair, right now you can see the 3D cursor, so it looks like that's the same thing, but it's really this yellow dot that's in the middle of the chair. And one of the things I'll demonstrate is that you can change that. You don't really need to, but just something that you might want to do. Okay, so we can see there's the chair, and we can, put it in our scene, and it has this default white material. We'll talk about materials more next week, but there it is. There's my chair. So that's pretty exciting. If I throw the GLTF in there, it's pretty much exactly the same thing. So that's great. So I'll remove that one. So with this thing, you'll see it's actually called intro example. It's not called chair because it's named after my Blender file. If I open up this scene, it's going to say you can't modify it. So that's fine, but I can still look at it. So we can see that this is my scene and there's my chair. And, if we had a material, we could edit it. I can throw a material on here. So if I want this to have a material, I can throw it somewhere. I'll just throw it on here. So you can add materials in there, but you can't change the geometry. You'd have to go back to Blender to change the geometry. Okay, so let's go back here. Oh, maybe it won't let me add a material. Oh yeah, I can't add the material. Okay, so never mind. We can't add a material here. Can I add a material here? No. Okay, there's a way to do that, but I kind of forget. We'll do materials next week. So for now, we're just worried about the geometry. So let's run the scene, and I'll be able to walk around in it. And there's my chair. So I can walk through the chair. So we may want to add a collider to it, but we can see it's in the scene. I don't have any lighting in the scene, so let's go ahead and add our lighting. Okay. So there we go. We have our chair. And so once you see it in the scene, you may want to make changes to it. And so we'll talk about things like materials, we'll add a collider, we'll do a lot of other stuff later, but just to keep this relatively brief, we are going to want to make changes to it. Your geometry is not going to be perfect, and we can't edit the geometry in Blender. So you might want to scale this or do other things, but remember, we don't really want to scale stuff in Godot. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So when we have the geometry, it's fine to move it around, but we want to avoid scaling it. So if we want our chair to be smaller, we need to go back to Blender and make the chair smaller and re-export it. This is very easy to do because we're just going to overwrite our model file. So this is a very typical workflow for working in 3D. We'll make something in Blender, see how it looks in Godot, and then we'll have to make adjustments. So I'll go back to Blender, and I'm going to put my chair back in the center. And let's say, well, let's deal with the scale first. So let's say I want to make it smaller. So when I scale the chair down, I can make it smaller and then save it. So I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to export it again. So I'm going to go to File, Export, and GLTF. And this time I'm going to stick with the GLB, and I'm going to click Remember Export Settings so I don't have to change them in the future. And I'm going to export my GLTF, or my GLB. And when I go back to Blender, you can see it's re-imported, and now my chair is small. So that's really all you have to do. It's pretty straightforward, relatively easy. And if we want to make more changes, we can do that. So let's say I don't want the chair to be oriented towards the middle. So right now my chair, you can see the transform is 0, 0, 0, but the geometry is like halfway below the sort of 0 point. And let's say I think it'll be easier to design if it's above there. I can go into edit mode, so I'm just hitting tab, and I'm gonna hit A to grab all my geometry, and then I'm gonna hit G and Z and just move it up on the Z-axis. And then I'm gonna go into front view and do that again just to get it like very precise. So it's right lined up there. I'll save that. So now you can see that little orange dot is at the bottom of the chair. So this is kind of the orientation of the geometry. This is where it's gonna be saved from or set from. So if I export this again, and go back to Godot, it's gonna re-import it, and now my chair draws from the bottom. And so, you know, in this case, that might be easier for, you know, aligning the chair with the floor and designing my scene. So you don't necessarily have to do it, but it might make your life a little bit easier. A couple other things. So I'll demonstrate a couple other things that you might want to look out for, but then we'll go back to workshop time. So with a model, if you look at our transform, you can see the scale is set to 0.27, 0.27, 0.27 because we like scaled it down. Sometimes you'll import models and the scale will be like really out of whack. And when you put it over to Godot, the scale still won't really make sense. Actually, I'm kind of curious to see if it's scaled here. Yeah, so you can see that it actually translates the scale over to Godot. So our mesh in Godot has the same scale as it has in Blender. So if you don't want that to be the case, if you're obsessive about not scaling things like I am, there's something that you can do where you can apply the position and the scale and the rotation. So if you hit Control A, it brings up this apply menu. And if I apply the scale, notice that the chair stayed the same size, but the scale is now 1, 1, 1. So it's normalized. If I export this again, to Blender, or to Godot. It's going to re-import it again. I'm going to reload it. Now you can see the scale is just going to be 111, which is what we like. But the scale of the actual chair has stayed the same. So you don't necessarily have to do this, but it makes it a little bit more efficient to apply your scale and rotation and stuff like that. Some game engines, they won't take those transform properties, so it'll appear, but it won't look right, and that'll be because you haven't applied stuff. So usually before I export stuff, I'll just hit Control A, and I'll actually just hit apply all transforms. So that'll, if I move this over and rotate it around like that, and then I hit Control A and apply all transforms, it makes these guys all go to 0 and the scale go to 1. And you can see the orange dot is in the middle of the scene again, so now the chair will actually be offset from the center. So that's not what I want in this case, but you might want that in some other cases. Another quick thing, you may not get into this right away, but another powerful way of editing in Blender is using modifiers. So if I select the object and I look at the modifiers over here, there's a lot of different modifiers and they do different stuff. It doesn't really make sense with a chair, but a very common modifier is a subdivision surface. If you add these, it's gonna add sort of roundness to the geometry, but it's not really real. So if I tab into edit mode, you can see the geometry is still the basics blocky geometry I had before. And so it looks nice. Maybe I like this kind of rounded looking chair, but if I export this, it's not going to take my modifiers over to Godot. So when I go back to Godot, my geometry for the chair is still blocky. So if I add modifiers to the geometry, the way that I can get them over to Godot is I have to apply them. So to do that, I can click on this drop down and click, I don't want to duplicate, I want to click apply. Okay, so now if I export this guy again, now my chair has that modifier on it. So the modifiers only exist in Blender. We have to apply the modifiers to get them over to Godot. Okay, one last thing and I'll be done. So you might notice once I add this nice subdivision surface, I have these nice round edges, but it looks kind of goofy and square. So this is just the shading style. And if I want to change that, I can go to Object and I can go to Shade Smooth. And now it'll look smooth. And that's something that will also go over to Godot. So if I export this again, and I go back to Godot, now our chair looks smooth and also, rounded. So yeah, those are a few different things. There's a million other things you can do with Blender, but those are just a few basic things you can use to get started. Next week, we'll look at downloading models from different sources on the web, and we'll edit them a little bit in Blender. Sometimes you can throw them right into Godot, but we can use Blender to edit them and look at the geometry. Because another thing that we want to be careful about is the size of our models. So right now, the model is still really small. It's a little bit bigger actually. It was 12 kilobytes, and that one subdivision surface added 100 kilobytes to it. So the models get big really quickly. So we really need to be careful about the size of the models. And we'll talk about that with models and with textures as well. We'll talk about that more next week. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I'm sure that's a lot to take in. There's a lot to do with Blender. I would just kind of play around with it, see if you can make some stuff. It takes a while before you get good at it. So if it seems hard at first, that's normal. It took me a really long time to get used to using it, but it is a really powerful program. Okay,